Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast this week. We are trying to just wrap up the year. It's crazy to think that we've been doing this podcast for about 7 months now, since May. And so we were thinking and reflecting on, hey, how could we wrap up this year? And what are some things that maybe some of our students dealt with, had questions about throughout the year? And so today we wanted to focus on study skills, because a lot of the questions we get are surrounding how do I study? How do I take notes? How can I be an effective student? And so today we wanted to just kind of break down study skills, what they are, what that looks like, how they can be applicable for you. So let's go ahead and dive in. So Sarah, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, so we've done lots of research. We've all had our own failures and successes and, our own academic journey when it comes to just learning new study skills. So we've tried to compile some of the things that have worked for us and things that we found through research to just give you guys ideas, and hopefully you can at least try a few of these to start with and maybe implement them in your daily routines. But we just wanted to go over some really great techniques, and let us know what you guys think, what works for you. And so one of the top ones that we've found that works for us, at least for myself, and based off of just different research that we've looked into, is it always pays to study less, but with a greater focus and intensity. So what that means is essentially, don't drag it out, right? Like it's a lot better to focus your time instead of scheduling 5 hours during the day and being distracted by every little thing around you, or being in a space that doesn't allow you to focus. You're better off just scheduling short bursts of highly focused time. You'll get a lot more accomplished in that time. A lot of people are, they like to pride themselves on, hey, I'm a great multitasker, but that actually isn't the most effective way to use your time, because you're constantly switching back and forth. Like your brain has to reshift and try to think about something else. So if you're trying to multitask, you're trying to do multiple things at one time while studying, it's just not effective. Schedule shorter, much shorter breaks, or much shorter time spans to get that studying in, and just focus. Put on some music if you have to. Some people like to listen to music while they study, like classical music, or like those brain study wave, videos you can find on YouTube can be super helpful. Whatever it takes for you to just maintain the focus, look at the task at hand, don't drag it out for hours and hours and hours. Keep it focused.
Well, and you bring up a good point about multitasking. I used to pride myself on multitasking and be like, hey, I can do this, I can do this, I can do it all. But then I was noticing that it wasn't as effective. So sure, I was doing all the things, but the output wasn't as high quality as it should be. So I love this idea of kind of breaking it down, making sure it's focused, like a solid 20 minutes of study focused and actually absorbing the information is better than, hey, I just spent an hour studying, but during that time I was also distracted. I was doing this, and I didn't really get as much out of it. So I like this idea of, breaking it down into smaller chunks, really focusing on that topic, maybe taking a break, coming back, and then doing another 20 minutes of focused study, because it's going to help your brain kind of have that mental break, as well as just help you stay a little more focused instead of, hey, I'm scattered and trying to do all the things and figure it all out at once. Like manageable tasks, our brains tend to absorb information better when they're not overloaded.
Totally. Another one is to space out your practice time. So they call it either spaced repetition or distributed practice, instead of cramming in one big session. And I'm laughing because this was me all throughout school. Oh my goodness. Like I am the worst when it comes to cramming. And luckily I made it work, but I was always just so burnt out. And you know what? That works great for like a unit test. But when it came time to final exam, I didn't remember anything because I crammed it all in. It didn't stick. And so there are so many studies that actually say that you'll retain more if you stay on top of what they call the forgetting curve.
Yeah.
So as soon as you learn something, you start spacing out the repetition, make flashcards for a unit after you've covered it and keep coming back to them, and make sure you do it soon enough after the unit that you're staying on top of that forgetting curve, and just keep revisiting it. You don't need to have this humongous study cramming session at the end if you just stay on top of that curve and space it out. And
Yeah.
it's difficult. Like, I know this one for me is super hard. So it's a tough
Yeah.
one for me even to tell others, because I'm like, oh, I'm just so guilty of doing this. But it's such a great technique if you
Yeah.
can do it.
Well, and I mean, you bring up a good point, after you go to class or you're taking your notes, that's a good time to make those flashcards. As you're reviewing your notes, get out a separate piece of paper, rewrite it on a flashcard, because then you're not only reading your notes from the class you just participated in, then you're making the flashcard to come in handy for later. Because I remember, being in college, I was taking one of the most failed classes on campus and stressing out for the final before it was even there, because I thought, I have to pass this class. I don't want to take this class again. And a lot of my friends in the same program were taking it for their second and third time. And I was like, oh, no, I don't want this to be me. So I was making the flashcards, and I remember I probably had like 500 flashcards, like no joke, just to remember all these things. And obviously at a high school level, hopefully there's not 500 flashcards. But the point is, like Sarah mentioned, staying on top of that forgetting curve, because part of it is going to be recalling that information for the final exam. So I love the idea of just reviewing your notes, writing the flashcard out then, and then just keep them in a stack. And then the next week, when you get more information, write out those flashcards and then just quickly quiz yourself on, what do I remember from the last time I was in class? Or what do I remember from the last unit test? How is this building on each other, right? Because that's typically how it works in these courses, is these concepts are building on each other. Like in history, it will help you understand, oh, this is what happened before that led up to this event. Math, it's the same thing. You're building upon these concepts. And so, yeah, I think flashcards are a very valuable tool, because then you can have your family or your friends say, hey, what's this one? Hold up the flashcard. What is this? Tell me what you know about it. And it's just that good mental reminder to help it stick.
Especially for just that, like the rote memorization part of it, like when you have to have definitions and stuff like that is especially when those are so handy. And what you said too about quizzing yourself, that actually is one of the other points. One of those great study skills that you can implement is quizzing yourself, especially taking a pre-quiz or a pre-test. We actually have it set up in some of our courses already for students who have pre-testing activated, but it's actually a great way to prepare yourself for a test, is testing yourself first before you've done your studying, just to get the questions in front of you and get familiar with what's going to be covered. And don't worry on how you do.
Well, but also it helps you identify the gaps.
Oh,
of
totally.
what to focus your energy on, right? Because there might be some concepts that you're like, oh, I get this makes sense, but I know that I struggle with XYZ. So this helps you kind of fine tune where you need to be focusing your energy and your time so that you can totally ace the test.
100%. It just gives you a more directed practice.
Yeah, for sure. And along those lines, the next one we found was like the Feynman technique, which is where you're basically teaching the concepts to somebody else, right? And I think that is a super effective one. I know, thinking back on my life, whenever I've had to do like a presentation or teach a class or whatever, I'm practicing it, right? And kind of practicing the teaching, the delivery. And so being able to do that with concepts of, okay, so I have, whether it's an oral presentation or you're prepping for a test, you can teach those concepts to somebody else, have a listening audience, and they can help you kind of recognize, oh, hey, it seemed like you weren't as confident here, here, or here. And again, just kind of bring in that directed focus for everybody.
Totally. Yeah. You start to learn where the gaps are when you now have to teach this to somebody else, right?
Yeah.
It's one thing just looking over and think, okay, I think I understand this concept pretty well, but as soon as it starts coming out of your mouth out loud to
Mhm.
teach somebody, you very quickly identify those things. You're like, oh, I'm not real sure on this part. And
Yeah.
that's a very, very quick way to identify those gaps and go back, review, and then try coming back again and reteaching it. And I think it's an underutilized technique, but it's
Yeah.
something that anytime I have used it in the past, it's been so beneficial for me. So
Yeah.
I love that technique. That's one I would really encourage. If you haven't tried it, just try it. It seems awkward and kind of weird at first because maybe your audience doesn't really want to know about the thing that you're teaching. Who knows? You know, it depends on what it is, I guess, in school. But yeah, super, super effective.
Yeah, definitely. And another one that you mentioned was the SQ3R technique. And this is especially helpful when you're reading a lot of text. Like,
Mhm.
there's some courses where there's a lot of reading, there's a lot of absorbing information. And so, the S part is just survey it, look over the readings, skim the titles, skim the headings, try to get a feel for what it is that you're going to be learning. And that will help you kind of establish an overview of the context, the purpose, as well as the expectations for the reading so that you're just kind of prepared to do it, because it does feel a little overwhelming when you're pulling out like a big textbook and you're looking through, or like you're on the internet and you're browsing all these pages and pages and
Right.
you're like, holy cow, where do I even start? There's so many concepts here. So just kind
Right.
of getting a feel for it, prepping yourself
Oh
for
yeah.
kind of what to
Yeah.
expect.
Getting a context of what the text is going to be about is going to be huge before you jump right into it. Just having an idea on where it's going, you know, getting an idea on how in depth it might be going on each of the topics. And so just even looking at the headings, like stuff like that, super, super beneficial. And then after you do that, then the Q part is starting to form questions. So Q is for question. Um, you just start forming questions based on the skimming that you just did and any prior knowledge you might have on the topic. So ask yourself, what am I curious about? What
Yeah.
questions do I have after looking over this kind of general outline of the text? What might I want to know more about this topic? And start asking those questions first before jumping into actually reading the text. So
Yeah.
now you have some context. Now you have an idea in your head, like, all right, what do I want to get out of this? Or what am I hoping to learn? Then you can jump into the first R, which
Yeah.
is
Three
read.
R's.
So the first R, yes, because SQ3R. So first R is read. This is where you then jump into the text. You read the text, you respond to and revise your initial impressions that you got through your skimming and your question asking and stuff like that. And it's really just going to help you identify the important information. And then revise your questions. After you start reading, you're probably going to have new questions. So feel free to write those down and keep giving yourself kind of like a new purpose for reading the text as you're going through it. And it's just going to help you absorb that and understand it more if you take that approach.
Yeah. And then after you've kind of done that, then we move on to the next R, which is recite. And this kind of goes back in line with what we talked about before, where you're teaching somebody else the information. So as you're reciting it, you're repeating it, you're paraphrasing it, and it's sticking a little more because you're vocally reciting it, you're saying it out loud. It's able to stick a little bit more if you're doing it, because it helps create that memory so that you can later recall it when you're in the test, and you'll think back to, okay, I was talking about this, what did I say, what did I remember? It just helps with that memory trigger, which is a huge part of studying as well as testing, is just recalling that information, tapping into those memory centers. And so I really find value in the recitation one, because it's like, okay, I've read it, it was in my head, now I've said it out loud. There's something about kind of saying it out loud, kind of like writing it down, where it just kind of triggers that brain center to recall the
Right.
information later.
And I would say this also would include like taking actual notes too on paper. So
Yeah.
not only just saying it out loud or teaching it to somebody else, but this is like the process where you're reciting it with your own words. You know, you're you're writing down what you find to be important. And this is helping you make that shift from just consuming the information to making applications to what you're reading and actually doing learning instead of just simply reading. So because we identified some context and some questions early on, this part should be a little bit easier now, because you already have in your mind, okay, what do I think is going to be important? What am I trying to get out of this? So
So
definitely
you're
taking great
automatically-
notes.
Yeah, you're automatically paying a little more attention, and then recognizing maybe which notes and things are more crucial for you.
So then the last one, the third R, is actually recall. So this is where you would review those notes, update your notes if you feel like you need to, and then just continuing to practice recalling the information, do self-assessments, kind of quiz yourself to gauge what your understanding level is of the text, and go back and revise as needed. So go through, skim through another like a previous section if you feel the need to return to it. Maybe detail out your notes for a certain portion, make some adjustments, and even ask more questions. Go back to that, like, okay, what am I still curious about? So this is a really cool method to reading, especially like we mentioned, when it's a lot of reading. So just jumping right into a really long text with no context is going to be a lot more challenging. This seems like, do I really need to go through this whole method to like read something, like read a textbook? But if there's a lot to be read, taking the time to do this up front is actually going to make your life so much easier. And the note taking just so much easier. It'll come more natural.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, and it helps break it down into chunks, like that's kind of back to the first concept we talked about, just breaking it down into more manageable things. Because I think a lot of times the overwhelm kicks in when we look at this huge thing and it's like, oh man, where do I start? Like, this feels overwhelming. This feels intimidating. It feels insurmountable. But if we can break it down and, like you said, just kind of have a general idea. And even when I'm reading a book that's like a nonfiction book, I'm like, okay, how long is this chapter? I kind of flip ahead, and I skim the headings, because then I'm like, okay, do I want to keep reading? Is this going to pique my interest long enough to continue reading? Especially if I have a busy day, but I kind of want that mental break, right? So I even do that in a non-studying situation, where I'm just reading. And so it's kind of interesting to like reflect and see how you kind of naturally already do that in your own life. And so maybe as you're sitting here thinking, well, what study skills, what's going to work the best for me? Maybe just sit down and think about it and say, how do I naturally react to situations where I'm in a new situation, where I'm learning something new? What do I gravitate toward? Because then that's already kind of revealing your strengths of what might be a good technique for you. And so it's going to take some kind of reflection and contemplative time. But if you can identify that, man, that's your superpower. You're already building on the skills that you have, and then you'll just unlock that greater potential to be better at studying.
So what's your favorite technique?
Oh man, I'm a nerd through and through. So I've always just taken notes and kind of like, what stood out to me? What do I feel like I need to remember? And I would take notes, and then later after class, I would go back and review them. And flashcards. Flashcards were big for me for memory recall, because if I can see it visually, it sticks a little better for me. And so I think those were kind of the most effective.
Were you a highlighter? Like, did you always color code and do that with your notes, or was it just like?
I didn't, because, back in the day before online school was a thing, we had old school textbooks, and sometimes, like the teachers would say, well, don't mark up the books, don't this or that, in high school, at least. I think there was only one book in college that I actually like highlighted and underlined, because I was that nerd. I was like, oh, books are nice. Like, I don't want to mess these up. But I would have notebooks and notebooks of just handwritten notes of things. But
yeah, I always like the different colored pens and stuff for like my notes. Like, I would always be like color coding, and not in the book necessarily, but on my notes, like highlighters, and then lots of doodles in the margin. But I like, it was my way of making it like a happy moment too. Is like, all right, I can look at nice doodles of flowers and
Yeah.
hearts and stuff,
Reflecting
and it kind of
back,
gets me through the studying.
yeah, I was like reflecting back, highlighting probably would have helped me. So like, okay, let's categorize these by concept, and maybe if they were color coded or highlighted, that might have, helped me a little bit more. But yeah, again, just find your rhythm, find what
Yeah.
works for you.
Totally. Yeah, I think my favorite tends to be the Feynman technique though, teaching to somebody else.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why I gravitate toward this field, education too, but I just always loved doing that. I like telling people about what I've learned, and it just makes it stick so much more. So
Yeah.
that's probably my fave.
Yeah. I think as an adult, that's definitely my fave, but reflecting back on high school experience, I don't think that was. It was more the flashcards and the notes and just
Sure.
kind of absorbing it personally. But yeah, as I've grown and evolved, it's like, oh yeah, hey, let me explain this to you so I can make sure I'm understanding it right. And then it kind of turns into that discussion as well. So
Totally.
yeah,
Cool.
I think, yeah, find what works for you and try
Mhm.
a couple things. And if you're frustrated, then try something new. There's no one right way to study is basically what we're trying to tell you. And find what works for you, because it's going to be different for everybody. And we all learn differently. We all have our own pace of learning, and that's okay. But, figuring out what works for you is going to help you hopefully reduce, some of that test anxiety or the fear of failure, or some of those things that come up around test time. But if you can get the skills in place now to just study
Mhm.
effectively, then you can walk into that test and be like, I'm going to ace this, I got this, I
Totally.
know that I've studied.
And start early. Don't wait.
Yeah.
Don't wait till the last minute. Don't be like
Cram.
me.
Don't be like
So,
Sarah.
so tell us, we want to know what works for you. So share it with us. We love to hear your stories. We love to hear feedback, and we can always share that with other students and families who want to continue growing and learning and building upon the skill set they already have. So please share with us. We love to hear it.
Yes. And join us next week when we are talking about more education topics and hopefully providing some insight to help you be a better student. Talk next time.